Well, Prynawn da. I'd like to begin this afternoon with the figures published at 12 noon, which show that by yesterday, more than 212,000 people have now received the first dose of COVID vaccine in Wales, and that was an increase of 22,000 in a single day. More people have been vaccinated in the 6 weeks since vaccination began than have tested positive for coronavirus over the whole course of the pandemic. And this is a real step forward in our vaccination programme. This slide shows you just how quickly the programme is picking up speed across Wales as supplies of the vaccine increase. 2 weeks ago, I set out our plans for increasing the number of mass vaccination centres and GP practices offering vaccination. Since then, we have exceeded all those plans. We have more clinics than ever providing vaccinations. More GP practices are offering the Oxford AstraZeneca jab, and almost 1,000 care home residents a day are being vaccinated in Wales. And that is because vaccination is our #1 priority. We are on target to hit our first milestone of offering vaccination to the first 4 priority groups by the middle of February. And there is, as you can imagine, a massive amount of work going on in Wales to make this happen. And of course, I understand that everyone is eager to have their jab, and not everybody will be vaccinated in the first couple of weeks. For those who are waiting, I thank you for your patience. And if you haven't been vaccinated yet, you will soon hear from the NHS about your appointment if you are in one of those top priority groups. Now, vaccination offers us a path away from the current public health crisis. But for the moment, we must all carry on, working together to slow the spread of this awful virus. Last week, I said we were seeing some encouraging signs that the virus was stabilising in Wales. As you can see from this slide, we can now say confidently that cases are falling in all areas of Wales. Overall, the 7-day case rate for Wales has dropped from over 650 before Christmas to around 270 cases per 100,000 people. And that's almost 100 points lower than it was last week. And as this slide shows, the rate is falling in all health boards right across Wales, including North Wales, where the highly contagious strain of the virus has become so dominant. But despite that promising picture, these are still very high rates, and around 16% of tests are still coming back positive, which demonstrate that there is still a lot of infection happening in the community. Our TTP service continues to work very well. 90% of tests that need a rapid result got one in a single day last week. And overall, since our Test, Trace, Protect service began back in June, 99% of cases eligible for contact tracing are successfully reached. Now, all of that is because of the hard work that goes on across Wales, by the efforts each one of us is making every day and the sacrifices that go alongside that. That is what is helping to bring the virus under control. Thank you for staying at home, for protecting the NHS, and for helping us all to save lives. Now, every 3 weeks, we review the current level of restrictions, and next week we will complete the second review of the Alert Level 4 lockdown measures. Every day, as you saw from the slide, we are now seeing cases of the virus fall in the community. But we need to see that fall also happen in our NHS to alleviate the pressures that the health service is seeing. Now, we have some encouraging early signs that the number of people admitted to hospital with coronavirus is starting to stabilise. But as of today, we still have very high numbers in hospital with COVID-19, and our critical care units particularly remain under enormous pressure. And we're having to factor in the added dimension of the new and emerging strains of the virus. We know that the highly contagious strain, sometimes called the Kent variant, is now widespread across Wales. And we are closely monitoring 3 other new variants, 1 from South Africa and 2 from Brazil. All of these are cause for concern. We already have 6 cases of the South African variant identified here in Wales. We are not immune at all to changes which can happen in other parts of the world. And this is why we all have to go on taking that cautious and careful approach, living with the restrictions that we have and that are making that difference. As we go into the review next week, our first priority, as ever, will be our children and our young people, looking for ways to get them back into schools and colleges when we have sufficient headroom to do so. Next week, alongside the 3-week review, we will also review the details of package of support to help the tens of thousands of businesses which continue to be affected by the pandemic. Today, I can say that next week we will be making a further £200 million available to support those businesses with their operating costs. And our unique £180 million support scheme for leisure, tourism and their supply chains is still open for applications. Altogether, we have committed more than £2 billion in support for businesses here in Wales. And of that, £1.7 billion has already reached those businesses. And that includes 178,000 grants worth £1 billion delivered through the hard work of our local authorities. We have provided the most generous package of support for businesses anywhere in the United Kingdom, over and above the wage support schemes available through the UK government. And we will go on doing all we can to make sure that businesses are able to recover from the pandemic and continue supporting jobs and our economy. Before I move to questions, I want to say just a few words about the flooding we saw in many parts of Wales following Storm Christoph. Once again, communities have seen record rainfall and the damage that flooding causes just a year after storms Ciara and Dennis. Our thoughts are with those people today who are returning to see their homes flooded. I want to extend my thanks to all those who worked through the night on Wednesday to protect life and property as the waters rose. These really are unprecedented times for all those having to deal with both the pandemic and a flooded home. It is a reminder to us all that while the public health crisis has dominated our thoughts, the climate crisis continues. Now, to support all those affected by flooding, the Welsh Government will put in place arrangements for local authorities to be able to make support payments of up to £1,000 available per household for the events of the last 48 hours and retrospectively to those who have been affected by similar events in the last few months. This is the same level of support available to a year ago when storms Ciara and Dennis hit Wales just before the pandemic. The support will therefore be in place to help people who have suffered significant flooding while coronavirus restrictions have been in place. Diolch yn fawr iawn unwaith eto I chi gyd. I'll turn now to take questions, and as ever, all the answers will be broadcast live on the Welsh Government's own social media channels. I'm going, first of all, this afternoon to Teleri Glyn Jones at BBC Wales.
Pnawn da, Prif Weinidog, diolch yn fawr iawn. Os gawn ni'r ateb cyntaf ma'n Gymraeg, os gwelwch yn dda. 30% according to today's vaccine numbers of the over 80s have been vaccinated. Vaughan Gething said this week that he was confident that 70% of over 80s will have been vaccinated by the end of this week. I presume that's Sunday. Forgive me, but that sounds like a very ambitious target. Is it still achievable, or is it that 70% will have been offered vaccines as opposed to will have been vaccinated?
Well, Terry, let me just explain some of the complexity behind what you've said. Ministers every day see information, operational data that comes in from the health service more or less in real time. The statistics that are published every day have a lag in them. They have to be collected formally from the health service, they have to be interrogated, they have to be quality assured, and then they are published as formal figures. They lag a number of days behind the information that we see and track every day as ministers. So just to give you an example or two, this morning I will have seen information that tells me that in Powys, for example, 16 practices are already sending letters out to people aged over 75, giving them appointments this week. I will have seen figures that tell me from Hywel Dda that 46 care homes have now had everybody vaccination complete, and I will have seen a set of figures of GP practices in Ceredigion where vaccination of the over 80s has been finished. Because we see the absolutely up-to-date, day-by-day data, that is what gives us the confidence to know that by the end of Sunday, 70% of over 80s and people in care homes will have been offered the vaccine and the vaccine delivered. There will be a number of days delay before the official data fully records what has been achieved by the end of this weekend. So just I esbonio yn fras, fel gweinidogion, ni'n weld bob dydd ffigurau sy'n dod I fewn oddi wrth yr bwrddau iechyd, sydd ddim yn ffigurau swyddogol, ond ffigurau mae nhw'n defnyddio bob dydd. Dyna pam ni'n wedi ddweud, be ni wedi ddweud am faint o bobl sy'n mynd I cael ei frechu yn yr grwpiau cyn diwedd dydd Sul. Ac oeddwn ni'n esbonio, dwi wedi weld heddi ffigurau o Powys, o Geredigion, o Hywel Dda I gyd sy'n dangos y nifer o bobl sy'n wedi cael ei frechu'n barod. A ffigurau swyddogol, dydy nhw ddim yn casglu popeth I fewn fel na, achos mae rhaid I ffigurau fel na, ffigurau swyddogol, gael eu checo, gael popeth I fewn, a maen nhw'n mwy araf na y ffigurau ni'n weld bob dydd fel gweinidogion a sy'n rhoi hyder I ni am beth mae'r system yn Cymru yn wneud, a mynd I wneud cyn diwedd dydd Sul.
Diolch yn fawr iawn. You've indicated that your priority, given the headroom, will be to reopen schools. With that in mind, and I appreciate it's difficult to put a specific date, but if you could give us an indication, perhaps, I think it would be very helpful to lots of people to be able to cope with this pandemic if we knew when we would see our loved ones again.
Well, you're right. It is an impossible question for me to be able to give in a sense of a definite date. I just want to be clear with people. The approach of the Welsh Government, the question that ministers ask at every review is there any headroom for us to begin safely to lift any of the restrictions that we are all currently living with? That's the approach we take. We are always wanting to restore freedoms to people. But we have to do it in a way that is safe. We have to do it in a way that is in line with the public health advice that our Chief Medical Officer and others will give us next week alongside the review. Things are improving in Wales. The figures that I showed you demonstrate the way figures are coming down. For the first time today, with more than 14,000 tests carried out yesterday, there were fewer than 1,000 new infections. But despite the fact that we see that encouraging trend, the overall figures do remain high. And I'm afraid there will be marginal headroom at best next week to be able to begin the process of lifting some of the current restrictions. As we get further into the year, as the weather improves, as it is easier for people to meet outdoors, and as those figures continue, we hope to improve, so our aim will be to continue to restore freedoms to people as we get into the year. The uncertainties are very real, as I set out in my opening remarks. With new variants being discovered and new dangers emerging too, it's impossible for me today to predict the future in a way that I know it would be wonderful for us all if I could say, oh, by that date, it'll all be back when we can do things again. It simply wouldn't be telling you anything that was reliable, I'm afraid. Diolch yn fawr, Teleri. Over to Adrian Masters at ITV Wales.
Thank you, First Minister. And I wonder if you could just clarify your first answer to Teleri. Do you mean that you might well hit that target or milestone of vaccinating 70% of the over 80s by Sunday, but we won't necessarily see those figures on Monday? And just to clarify further, are you talking about actual vaccinations or offers of vaccination?
Well, on the second point, our promise always was to have offered vaccine to people, and we know that there are people who don't take up the offer, who make a decision for themselves that they don't wish to be vaccinated. So it's always been that we would offer the vaccine to people in the top 4 priority groups, but that we hope that 70% of people would be vaccinated by the end of Sunday. Everything that has been done over the next 3 days will not be captured in the figures that we publish on Monday, because these figures move so very rapidly. So, Adrian, maybe just to give one more illustration of that, yesterday the official figures were published of the number of vaccinations carried out in every health board. It showed, from memory, that there were 32,000 vaccines carried out in the Cynhadledd health board area in North Wales. I saw figures overnight that told me that Cynhadledd is already above 40,000 in the number of vaccines carried out. So the official data does take a while to catch up with the reality on the ground, and it will be a couple of days into next week before we've captured everything officially that will happen between now and the end of Sunday.
Thank you. And if I could ask you, please, your thoughts about the alleged incident that happened in the Cynhadledd before Christmas. I realise an investigation is underway and the details of that will become clear. I also realise that the Labour member involved has been suspended from the group. What should happen with the others? Should the Welsh Conservative leader stand down? Should the others stand down? And if they don't, what else should happen? And with the Labour member involved, would you look at further sanctions, including suspending him from the party itself?
Well, as soon as I was told on Monday evening of what had been brought to light, I immediately made the decision that the Labour member should be suspended. Suspension is a neutral act. Suspension allows the investigation to continue, and when the allegation is a serious one, as this certainly is, then I was sure that that was the right thing to do. It's not for me to make decisions about members of the Conservative Party, but from the fact that I suspended the Labour member, you can take it that I believe that other people in the same position should not simply have carried on as though nothing at all had happened. What needs to happen now is that the investigation needs to be concluded. It needs to be concluded thoroughly, but I do believe it needs to be concluded as swiftly as it can as well. And then we will all be able to see what actually happened that evening, and further decisions will rest on that. In the meantime, I'll just say two things that I think, in my mind, that are very important. As I understand it, and the investigation will reveal this properly, there was a single member of staff on duty that evening. I'm very anxious that this does not all result in that person carrying the can for what happened that evening. That was a single female member of staff faced with a collection of senior Cynhadledd members. The idea that the staff member was to blame seems to me completely incredulous, and I very much hope that this does not head in that direction. And then I think people will want to compare what people have said with what the investigation concludes. I saw the statement from the leader of the Welsh Conservatives and from Darren Miller, who is with him, that they had gone in for a drink after work. I think the implication from that was clear to me, that they called in, had a swift half, and were on their way home again. People will want to compare the explanation that people have given against what the investigation concludes, and that's why it's important that the investigation is thorough, but concludes as quickly as possible as well.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Adrian. Drosodd i Adam Hale at PA.
Diolch, Prif, Weinidog. You said in the Senedd this week that Wales's older population on average had been recognising your with the other nations regarding vaccine supplies, and that as a consequence, you said actions are being taken to take that into account. What actions are we going to be seeing? And does that relate perhaps to the overall amount of doses Wales will be receiving, or the type of vaccine? Is it the easier to transport vaccine we could be seeing more of come here?
Well, Adam, you're absolutely right. It was about the remarks were about the supply of vaccine, and the conversations that I'd had with the other First Ministers and with Michael Gove at the Cabinet Office. There was a recognition in that conversation that different parts of the United Kingdom do have different population profiles. And in order to match the Welsh profile, we probably need a little bit more of the vaccine and a slightly different combination of the two vaccines early on. Later on in vaccination, our population probably means we won't need as much as some other parts of the United Kingdom, because we will have proportionately fewer people in those age groups. That was the nature of the conversation, and as I said, I thought it was a very sensible conversation and gave me confidence that the nature of the Welsh population was being taken into account in the plans for providing vaccine to us.
Thank you. And what's your thoughts on this £500 payment for people who test positive? Do you think people should be receiving that amount regardless of their financial situation?
Well, I think, as far as I can tell, it was a kite flown overnight that has come very firmly down to earth this morning, with UK ministers out denying that this was ever a serious proposition. If the UK government were to institute such a scheme, we would, of course, expect to have an equivalent sum of money to allow us to do something here in Wales. In the meantime, I am expecting advice next week about our own scheme, looking for ways in which we can simplify it, in which we can make it quicker, and in which we can maybe extend a little some of the categories of people who are able to benefit from it. We've had around 20,000 applications to it so far. Around 10,000 of those have been accepted. Over £2.5 million has already been paid out. And we've learnt a lot from the early weeks of it. And next week we'll be looking to make decisions to see how we can improve it further. Adam, diolch yn fawr. Over to Abby Whittick at Wales Online.
Afternoon, Minister. Thank you. I can just go back to the vaccine. We've been told that some care home staff and also some nursing staff, even some working in COVID wards, are refusing the vaccine over safety fears. I just wondered whether you'd had any feedback on numbers of frontline staff refusing the jab in this way, and what's your message to them? Should they be allowed to work if they refuse the jab?
Well, I haven't got specific figures, but I did discuss this as well with the other First Ministers and with the UK government. And we're going to try to come together next week with some figures from around the UK to see whether there are any patterns emerging of people who accept the offer of the vaccine and people who turn it down. Every year in flu vaccination, I myself am taken aback by the number of people who work in direct health roles who choose not to take the flu vaccination. And my message to people who work in the front line is, please take the help that is on offer through the vaccine. It will protect you, and more importantly, in the jobs that people do, it will protect others as well. But in the end, this is a voluntary scheme. And people who have all sorts of reasons as to why vaccination is not right for them have to be able to exercise that judgment. But given the seriousness of the position we are in, and everything that has been done so incredibly rapidly to provide vaccination for us all, I really do hope that people who are in those frontline jobs and have done such fantastic work over the last 12 months, that as many of them as possible will take up the offer that is being made.
Thank you. Just on lockdown, I know it's very difficult to give dates for anything, but obviously there are encouraging signs. Infection rates are somewhere on the level with early December, and there are less than 300,000. Sorry, there are less than 300,000. Whatever the figures are, 100,000 are less now than they were. And that's one of the targets for getting lockdown to be eased. Schools are supposed to be reopening perhaps by the middle of February. Are any of those dates at all realistic now? Are we looking more to late spring, early summer? I mean, I know you can't give an exact date, but no. Are we being realistic saying that schools might open in February at all? Can't you be more clear to people when they're trying to plan?
Well, here is how I see it at the moment. I think I probably said last week that I chaired a meeting of the teacher unions, the staff unions in schools, the local education authorities. We all agreed that we would work purposefully together to find ways of bringing more young people back into the classroom. Does that mean that we will see a wholesale return of every child in every classroom every day of the week across Wales? I do think that is probably unlikely, but there are intermediate positions between where we are today with very few children in school and everybody being back. And some of those practical ideas were put forward by trade union colleagues and by local education authorities as well. Ways in which some children for some of the week could still be back in the classroom if they're preparing for qualifications. Very young children for whom online learning really isn't a genuine possibility. I thought it was a meeting with a number of creative and imaginative proposals around the common goal of getting more children back into school. I certainly don't rule out making some of those things happen after the February half term, but I do think it's unlikely in the way you said that we will see every child back full time in every classroom in the way that we would ideally wish to do. Thanks. I'll be over to Dan Bevan at LBC.
Thank you, First Minister. Good afternoon. I've spent the morning in Skewen seeing the devastating impacts from the floods that have happened there over the last few days. You've said previously that these kinds of events are going to happen more regularly because of the effects of climate change. But residents there aren't simply going to accept that this happens as a regular thing. I wonder what more you're doing to help prevent the floods from happening rather than just helping the people who have been affected by the flooding.
That's a point I completely agree with. Dan. The strategy of the Welsh Government is not simply to help people after the event, although we definitely will mobilise help for people in Sgwyn, in other parts of Wales, who've been affected in recent times. We have a £300 million programme of flood defence work going on in Wales during this term. And while what happened over the last 48 hours is dreadful for those people affected, actually in some ways the big story of what happened over those 48 hours is the extent to which existing flood defence schemes that have been built up over the last 20 years protected houses right across Wales. When I saw the reports of people in Bangor-on-Dee being asked to leave their homes, I was reminded that back in the year 2000, my friend and predecessor, Rodri Morgan, visited Bangor-on-Dee when there was a major flooding event there. And that led to major flooding works being carried out, which actually prevented flooding in Bangor-on-Dee over the last couple of days. And that preventative work, having more flood defences in place in those areas which are particularly prone to flooding, is very much part of what the Welsh Government is committed to doing and does do every single day.
Thank you. And if I can go back to getting some further clarity on the vaccinations for over 80s, this is the first time we've been told about this data lag that you described. Some would accuse you of moving the goalposts on this target. So I wonder, is that something that you're trying to address, this data lag? And would you say that going forward, when is this target going to be, or when will we find out that this target's been hit?
The data lag is inevitable, and it is part of all the figures that all government departments put out. If you read the weekly ONS reports on deaths in care homes or levels of infection, it always tells you that this is data that refers to what was happening several days, sometimes a week or more ago, and that there is a lag between the publication and the period that it is reporting over. There's nothing at all that is unusual or special in what I have described this morning. It is just what always happens. The data that governments have and health boards have is the up-to-date day-by-day data. The data that is published as official figures has to be reviewed, it has to be quality assured, it has to have the stamp that goes with being an official figure. And that inevitably means that it runs, a few days behind the actual delivery of any sort of service of this sort. And in vaccination, where the numbers are rising at the speed that people will have seen on that first slide today, and where we've done 22,000 yesterday alone, then that lag is always going to be, under-reporting what is being achieved. We will continue to report figures in the way we do. We put as much data into the public domain as we can, and then sometimes we have to explain to people how to make best sense of it. Dan, thank you. Over to Andy Davis at Channel 4.
Thank you. First Minister, earlier in the week, you gave an interview in which you said that it was better to make the stocks of the Pfizer vaccine in Wales last until the next resupply date, in order in part to avoid vaccinators standing around doing nothing. Subsequently, there was a host of government statements appearing to contradict that, saying no vaccine stocks were being held back. Just so we understand, did you get that wrong? Did you misunderstand it? Were you given the wrong information? And do you understand public concern about clarity in government messaging, Welsh government messaging right now? We've just had a week in which there's been confusion over data, mixed messaging, repeated clarifications over ministerial statements, and at a time, arguably, when it couldn't be more important to have clear government messaging about this vaccination programme.
Well, Andy, I certainly agree about clarity, so let me be clear again today. Vaccination is the top priority for the Welsh Government and for the Welsh NHS. Our ambition is to vaccinate as many people as quickly as possible and as safely as possible, using every drop of vaccine that we have and every individual that we have capable of delivering the vaccine. That is the story. That is the clarity that I want people to have. Nothing is being held back. Nobody is standing idle. Everybody is working as hard as they can on this top priority programme with the results that we are able to report and which people will have seen today.
Can I say as politely as possibly, I don't think you answered the question over whether you got it wrong. But let me move on to my second question, if I may. You've not suggested that Wales is being given proportionately fewer vaccines than the rest of the UK, nor that we're getting a different balance of the two vaccines. So do you agree that it is a legitimate concern that Wales has been slower to reach the over 80s than some other parts of the UK, especially at a time when speed is of the essence? And do you feel you fully understand why that has been happening?
Well, the ambition that we have is to vaccinate as many people as quickly as we can. Supply of the vaccine is a limiting factor in that, but I don't believe that Wales is being treated unfairly. I think we have an agreement with the UK government about supply of vaccine, and I think that the people who are responsible for the supply of vaccine are working as hard as they possibly can as well to get vaccine available in all parts of the United Kingdom in the ratios that match the needs of those local populations. If at any time I thought that Wales was being somehow deliberately shortchanged, I would absolutely certainly say so. But that's not my belief. I think everybody is doing everything they can to get us what we need and then for us to use that as fast as possible. The latest figures that are published on a UK comparison don't show Wales in last place. We've moved ahead of Scotland, and the rate at which vaccination is increasing faster in Wales than any other part of the United Kingdom. But let me say again, the race here is not with other nations. The race is with the virus. The race is between infection and injection. And that's the race that we want to win here in Wales, and to offer to vaccinate all people in those top 4 priority groups by the middle of February, and we believe that we remain on course to do so. Andy, thank you. Over to Hywel Griffith at BBC News.
Prif Weinidog. We know there's been a huge increase in the number of patients having to wait over 9 months for planned treatment. We know some urgent surgery and cancer treatment has had to be cancelled because of this pandemic. What do you say to patients and to the public about how long the impact of this pandemic will last through our NHS, both in terms of delaying treatment and seeing very fraught staff members working in our hospitals?
Diolch, Hywel. That's a very important and, I'm afraid, long-term question. Our Health Minister, Vaughan Gething, has said over many months that it will take a whole Senedd term to recover to where we were this time last year. And that is hugely frustrating for all those people who had worked so hard to bring down waiting times in the Welsh NHS. In February of last year, the number of people waiting, the length of time they were waiting, was the lowest since 2013. And that was as a result of 5 years of sustained investment by the Welsh Government, but sustained activity by the people who work in our health service. And in a single year, we've seen that 5-year effort having to be set aside. So we have, of course, a sense of how we will try and restore that activity in the Welsh NHS, and it will be the simple way in which the NHS in Wales has always operated, that as we are able to move back to do more for non-coronavirus care, it will be done in order of clinical priority. the people who will be treated first will be the people whose needs are the greatest and most urgent. And there is some emergency work to recover, although it's also important for me to say that emergency work does continue right across Wales, and cancer care continues right across Wales. But there is some emergency work that we have to recoup, and then we will move on to the planned care that has had to be delayed. But it's going to be the work of a full Cynhadledd term to make up for all the delays that attending to the urgent needs of people who are so ill with coronavirus that they can only be looked after in hospital to get us back to where we were before coronavirus started.
To more immediate matters, a week from today, you'll tell us the results of the review. You said the priorities, the youngest children and exam years. Do you think you would already rule out the possibility of some children returning before half term? And further on, for the greater public, how long realistically will stay at home be part of the messaging? Are we talking weeks or months?
I have asked the Chief Medical Officer for a specific piece of advice next week as part of the review as to whether there is any prospect of a greater number of children returning in the week before half term. And if there were any prospect, what would we use that week to do? Now, it may well be that the Chief Medical Officer will say to me that there isn't any prospect, that we don't have the headroom to do that. But because our priority is children and their education, I've asked him for a specific view as to whether or not there is anything that could be done in that week. And I don't know what he will tell me, but by the time I'm standing here next week, I will, and I will be able to explain where that has got us. The stay-home message is a terrifically difficult message for people. And as our Chief Medical Officer indeed has always emphasised, there's 4 different sorts of harm from coronavirus, including the impact on people's mental health and well-being of not being able to see people who are so important to them in their lives. So, our aim as a Welsh Government will be to restore freedoms to people, particularly those freedoms that matter so much on a human level, as soon as there are opportunities to do so. Is that going to come to us in the next couple of weeks? I'm afraid even with the figures we are able to report, that isn't likely, because what we can't afford is to throw away all the work that people have done in the lockdown that we've had since before Christmas. And we know that as soon as we allow people to meet together again, however modestly that is, this is a virus that will exploit all those opportunities. And that we will see the numbers that we have today, instead of falling, beginning to rise again. And we will need, more headroom than we currently have, and our health service will quite certainly need to be under less pressure than it is today before we can move in any purposeful way in that direction. Hywel, diolch yn fawr. Over to Tom Moody at the South Wales Argus.
Good afternoon, First Minister. Previously, only tests that have been sent to Lighthouse Labs were able to distinguish if a positive test was either the common strain of COVID or one of the new variants. Are Public Health Wales labs now able to identify this? And if not, what's been done to ensure that we get an accurate picture of how prevalent these new variants are across the whole of Wales?
Well, Tom, I think the good news is that we probably do have a good idea. I'm afraid that we think that in North Wales, 80% of new cases are likely to be the new variant that was first discovered in the southeast of England, and that in South Wales, that's likely to be 50% and rising. We know that primarily through the Lighthouse Labs, and we had an earlier insight into the North Wales position because more tests from North Wales go to a Lighthouse laboratory that's able to detect the new variant. The public health labs are working to be in a position to distinguish the new variant. They're already able to do some of that work. And our genomic sequencing that we do in Wales, which is a very significant, world-leading set of arrangements, is also able to identify it. But from what we know from Lighthouse Labs, by now we have a much more settled understanding of the way the new variant is spreading. And it is happening in Wales as it happens elsewhere. It is a more aggressive form of the virus. It crowds out the original variant and it becomes the dominant variant. That's already happened in North Wales and it is happening in South Wales as well.
Okay, thank you. And I wanted to ask about Gwent as well. Before Christmas, it was the third worst affected area in Wales. Its case rate stood at more than 1,000 per 100,000 people. But as of today, I think it's the fourth lowest case rate in Wales, and it's reduced to 161.7 per 100,000 people. From the data you've seen, is there any particular reason behind this, and how can this sort of be replicated elsewhere in Wales?
I think the general explanation is what we've seen previously, which is the sort of wave effect of coronavirus. It starts somewhere and that area becomes very badly affected, and then it moves further away from that area, and that area tends to recover faster than others. So I think, you know, the pattern we've seen in Wales has been the virus starting in the southeast corner, places like Gwent being the firing line first of all. Then the virus moves west and north. And as you say, today, the rates in Gwent are lower than they are in Gwynedd, for example, in northwest Wales, which stood out against the virus for so long. But I think the big explanation is that's a wave pattern the coronavirus tends to have. Gwent at the moment is seeing the plus side of that, just as it had to live through some very difficult days and weeks when the extent of the virus was much higher. It's also a tribute to the actions of those people who live in that part of Wales and the tremendous support that there has been for the measures that we have had to ask people to take. And the efforts in the Gwent area have really been outstanding and contribute to the way in which those figures are coming down. Tom, thank you very much. Over to Rob Taylor at wrexham.com.
Good afternoon. Elsewhere, some countries and states have been increasing the requirements for mask wearing. Parts of Germany now require people to wear higher grade FFP2 masks if they go to shops or take public transport. The Austrian government are going to take similar steps, and I believe France are looking at similar recommendations. What's your view on those actions, and do you think the Welsh guidance looks rudimentary in comparison, as currently the guidance still refers to people can still wear, you know, a scarf, for example, made out of cotton?
Well, the advice that we have in Wales is the advice of the Chief Medical Officer. And regularly throughout the whole of the coronavirus crisis, he has reviewed his advice. The advice in Wales is that if you are in an enclosed space, if you are close to other people, then wearing a face covering is definitely advised. If you are on public transport or in shops, for example, you have to wear one. It's obligatory. But the advice is beyond what's obligatory and gives people a good sense of where it would be a sensible course of action to take. At every review, the Chief Medical Officer returns to consider mask wearing alongside all the other social distancing and hand washing and all the other non-pharmaceutical interventions that we can take, and that will happen again next week, and we will follow the advice that he provides.
Thank you. And your comments earlier on the drinking investigation are a concerning insight behind the scenes of Cardiff Bay. You paint a picture of a possible 4v1 situation between senior members and a lone female member of staff. To be clear, are you personally aware of any pressure put on that member of staff to serve alcohol? And to you, what kind of time frame constitutes the swift investigation? And if you can comment when you first were made aware of the allegations.
Made aware of the allegations on Monday evening. And at that point made the decision that the Labour member involved should be suspended to allow those investigations to continue. I don't think it is for me to set a time frame. The investigation is in the hands of the Cynhadledd Commission, led by the presiding officer. and I'm sure that they are working hard to get it concluded in a thorough but swift way. I was, in the remarks I made, I was responding not to anything that I know directly. I was certainly not there myself, but to some of the reports that I had read that were suggesting that somehow the responsibility was not on the individuals concerned, but lay with the people who were responsible for serving alcohol. And I just wanted to make it clear that in the circumstances that I have seen, I'm not a great user of the facility myself, but on the very rare occasions that I've been there, there is a single female member of staff who serves behind the counter, and any idea that all of this could be put at the door of a single individual in that way would be highly unacceptable to me. Rob, thank you very much. Over to Alan Evans at Llanelli Online.
Thank you, First Minister. The First Minister has made the rules on restrictions very clear to the people of Wales, the majority of whom have responded appropriately. The consequences for the people of Wales who break the rules are dire and swift in court. I appreciate there's going to be an investigation into the behaviour of the members of the Senedd and hope they would end up in court to face the same judgment if they have broken the rules. Will the presiding officer now be reminding all members of the Senedd of their responsibilities and duties to the people of Wales during the pandemic?
Well, the presiding officer does very regularly draw people's attention to what is required of them, but I'll do it, and I'll do it very willingly again this afternoon. It has always been my view that if you have the privilege of making the law in Wales, then you cannot possibly be a lawmaker and a lawbreaker, and regard that as something that can just be shrugged off. As you said, Alan, we have had to take decisions that have placed the most enormous restrictions on people's freedoms that it would be unthinkable to have done what we have done other than in wartime. But they've been necessary during the crisis. And as you've said, the vast majority of people in Wales work so hard to stick to the rules every day. We cannot possibly expect other people to follow the rules when we are not doing everything we can to make sure that we are complying with them ourselves.
Over 3,800 fines have been handed out in Wales in relation to breaking restrictions. The majority have been men between 18 and 24. We know what happens when people are caught for motoring offences. They're sent on a training scheme. Would the First Minister consider such a scheme in Wales in order to modify behaviour of these men and indeed anyone who continually breaks the rules?
Well, I'm very happy to have that conversation with the police in Wales. Our decisions on fines have always been guided by what our police services tell us they need in order to be able to effectively enforce the law. And as you will know, Alan, while if people make a first mistake, the level of fine is about £60, but a second mistake doubles that, and by the time you get to repeated offences, it doubles every time, and that surely sends a message to people that making mistakes is understandable the first time, but it's not a sensible person who goes on making that mistake. If there's something more that we can do, the police's approach has always been to educate, to inform, to encourage, and if there's more that we can do to make that effective, I'm very happy to take that idea up in the conversations that I regularly have with police and crime commissioners and chief constables as well. Diolch yn fawr. Finally, for this afternoon, to Tom Magna at Carers World.
Thank you very much indeed, First Minister. I'd like to focus on vaccine priority again, as I did last Friday. The Joint Committee for Vaccination and Immunisation has their advice band 6, and I'd like to look at that in more detail. Before the 30th of December, band 6 referred to, and I quote the text, all individuals aged 16 years to 64 years with underlying health conditions which put them at higher risk of serious disease and mortality. On the 30th of December, the JCVI added unpaid carers, but unfortunately put them in a separate footnote to this band. Now, the Scottish Government republished the JCVI list in their policy documents, changing the wording of band 6 to end as and unpaid carers. So in Scotland, there's no onus on unpaid carers to identify before receiving their jabs. But in Wales, wherever I've seen the republished JCVI list, Band 6 has not been reworded to include unpaid carers, and the critical footnote is nowhere to be seen. The very real effect is to leave out unpaid carers. One of the worst examples is a viewer from South Wales who tells me she's known her GP for 40 years. She's been an unpaid carer for 30 years. The other day she rang up and was told, well, we haven't got you down as an unpaid carer. Do you accept that by your government not republishing the JCVI list with unpaid carers in the wording of Band 6 itself, by contrast to Scotland, it's led in Wales inevitably to avoidable inaccurate information, confusion and worrying?
Well, Tom, thank you for raising this with me last week. As a result, I've read the JCVI footnote, and I've also, as it happens, I've seen the way in which the Scottish advice puts that into the text of what they have published. And I'm very happy to say that we will follow that, and we will do that now in Wales as well. We're not hearing you, Tom.
Because despite 200 briefings or so, I still can't find the mute button sometimes. So I do apologise for that. Thank you very much indeed for that very helpful answer to question 1. But it's not just Band 6. Other viewers across Wales are telling us that when you speak, not necessarily you personally, but your government speaks of Band 4 vaccination targets, for example, there's rarely, if ever, any detail for the clinically extremely vulnerable in that band. Do you think over all of this, as well as the undertaking you've given in reply to question 1, do you believe it's time to deploy the government system that sends out council tax bills to every household to put all Welsh unpaid carers, no matter what their vaccine priority band, on a par with Scotland over recognition and understanding and support?
Well, Tom, I'm aware that advice has gone to the Health Minister about a further letter to go from the Welsh Government. It's gone variously in the name of the Minister and the Chief Medical Officer to everybody on the group of those clinically vulnerable. Now, I have not myself seen the text of the letter, but I've seen the advice that says a letter should be sent. I'm very happy, and it's one of the very useful things about these exchanges, that it sometimes alerts us to things that we need to go and follow up. So I'm very happy to go and follow up the letter that is being drafted and see whether it can reflect some of the points that you've raised, because that letter will be going to every household in Wales where there is somebody on those clinically vulnerable registers.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much indeed.